And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again, and today is continuing spiraling into the centre of the DC Rebirth era, but this is a slightly unplanned video that has come on the back of a couple of emails and several comments that I received from the last video and the video before it and stuff, which actually was totally fair and kind of highlighted something that I'd overlooked doing, talking about DC Rebirth, and that is really delineating and articulating the very specific parameters of what I consider to be included in DC Rebirth and what I'm going to be ignoring in DC Rebirth. Now, I did this for my New 52 guide way back in the day. I kind of said the things that were included and weren't included, and then I just kind of like ran with it. Obviously, with a lot more people kind of watching the channel and watching the videos, it's probably worth me doing it in a bit more precise detail, or rather with a more exacting level of precision, and that's what this video is. For anyone that's been asking, oh, why is this not included, or are you going to include X, Y, or Z, what I'm going to run through in this video is what I'm defining as the DC Rebirth era and what is falling within the 8 categories that I consider to be DC Rebirth, which you can see on the screen here, and more specifically why there are so many things that aren't covered in these 8 categories. So with no further ado, the DC Rebirth era is something that can be defined as running from May 25th, 2016, which was the day the DC Rebirth one-shot came out, all the way up until January 2021. As far as I'm concerned, it ends just as Future State begins. So Future State is when basically DC Rebirth ended, and then that's the line between DC Rebirth and Infinite Frontier. And when I do my Infinite Frontier read through and guide, I'll cover Future State in that. But DC Rebirth, like I say, is everything from the one shot coming out all the way up until, but not including, Future State in January 21. So if you were to have a list of every single comic that was published and released by DC during that time window, that's everything that's technically, I guess, in the DC Rebirth era. But for the purpose of clarity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the things that were published during that 5-year window, which I'm not including, and why. Also, in terms of just being clear, I'm going to point out that I know the DC Rebirth branding stopped about 2017, 2018, and it moved into DC Universe branding. But as far as I'm concerned, that's just like part of the same overarching era for lots of reasons that are just obvious when you read it. So, if we consider DC Rebirth comics to be everything published between those 2 dates, then what are the ones I'm excluding? Right, I'll run straight through it. So the very first thing I'll point out, and I talked about this in my Black Label video, is I'm going to be excluding Vertigo comics. So in terms of that, I'm not going to talk about things that started being published before September 2016 or were prequels to pre-existing series. So if there was an ongoing Vertigo thing going on, obviously that's just in Vertigo. And you have to keep in mind Vertigo closed down in January 2020. But what that means is that all the following series you can see all started being published and finished being published during the DC Rebirth window between 2016 and when Vertigo closed in 2020. So all of these series came out during that period, and they don't count at all, in my mind, towards DC Rebirth because they fit in the, or rather under, Vertigo. The next section of comics that I need to point out I'm not going to include are the Beyond Universe titles. Now, Batman Beyond is a concept that involves, obviously, the Bat mythos and the Bat family. It's set in like a future setting, so a high-tech cyberpunk future, several years into the future. Bruce Wayne's still alive, but the main character is Terry McGinnis, who gets recruited by an elderly Bruce Wayne to kind of take up the mantle. Now, the original TV show had this in the future of the DC animated universe, but it's since been kind of adopted into the multiversity perspective as Earth 12. And Terry McGinnis was actually introduced into the regular DC universe in New 52. So basically, Batman Beyond has had several series of comics. In fact, it had 5 volumes with a big V up until, but not including DC Rebirth. And there's also stuff like Justice League Beyond and Justice League Unlimited and Beyond, that sort of stuff. Long story short, I've actually got a guide for this on my channel. There's a separate reading guide with a separate map, and there are 3 videos on that guide covering the entire Beyond universe up to and including the ones that are in the DC Rebirth era, of which there are 8 trade paperback collections, 50 single issues. The Beyond universe is really interesting because whilst it's its own thing, for a while it kind of intersected with the mainline universe, especially in the New 52. So if you're interested, you can check out my New 52 map, and section 7, which is the Earth 2 parallel continuity. That includes stuff like Future's End and Convergence and stuff like that. That actually ends with Batman Beyond and Terry McGinnis. Now, that was in the New 52. In DC Rebirth, as I say, there are 8 trade paperbacks that are branded DC Rebirth, but actually they're part of the Beyond universe. They're not part of DC Rebirth, and at some point I'll go back and I will update the Beyond universe map. The map that you can see here does show the DC Rebirth volumes, but after DC Rebirth, Batman Beyond and that Beyond universe has continued with Batman Beyond Neo Year, Neo Gothic, and Static Beyond, which continues up until the present day. So the whole Beyond universe thing started well before the New 52, goes on well after DC Rebirth, and the DC Rebirth branded Batman Beyond comics aren't part of DC Rebirth as far as I'm concerned, irrespective of the branding. And I say that because I've read them. I read all of them. And the Beyond Universe guide, as I say, is on my channel. Next up is DC Zoom. So you may or may not have heard of the imprint Zoom, but you will definitely have seen some of the comics involved in it. So DC Zoom Books was an imprint that started in 2018, and it was directed specifically at kind of middle grade readers. So this imprint specifically was stated not to be part of the main continuity, and as such I could throw it in the out of continuity section of my DC Rebirth guide, but the truth is it was very much aimed at children. In fact, in 2020 DC Zoom was replaced by a new imprint called DC Graphic Novels for Kids, so it only lasted for 2 years, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But titles in DC Zoom are things like Black Canary Ignite, Super Sons, of which there were a couple of different volumes, The Secret Spiral of Swamp Kid, which is a bit of an odd comic, and Dear Justice League, which I would strongly recommend. It's very much kid focused. It's absolutely a child friendly comic, but it's actually really great. So if you've got kids, I strongly recommend Dear Justice League. Parallel to DC Zoom, we've got DC Inc., which started and was also cancelled in 2020. So this was an imprint directed at young adult readers. So again, like DC Zoom, DC Inc. was not part of the main continuity. So it was meant to be out of continuity, but again, very, very, very child focused. So I didn't want to put it in my normal out of continuity comics. And in 2020, again, DC Inc., whilst it started in early 2020, it closed down in late 2020 and was replaced by DC Graphic Novels for Young Adults. In that sense, both DC Zoom and DC Inc. were essentially merged into that new imprint. That said, DC Inc. titles were things like Batman Nightwalker, Harley Quinn Breaking Glass, Mira Tidebreaker, and Teen Titans Raven, and there were a few others, but that's what DC Inc. was, and like I say, it merged into the graphic novels for young adults. In terms of that line, it's worth noting, whilst this new merged imprint began in 2020, it was a lot like Black Label or the Vertigo debacle before it, meaning that a lot of titles shuffled in and out of its branding. So titles that had been DC Inc. and DC Zoom, when they came under reprints, they actually got rebranded as being DC Graphic Novels for Young Adults. And there is actually a story which is called Supergirl Being Super, which is a fantastic, great story, and actually is part of DC Rebirth Out of Continuity. I'm going to be covering it literally in my next video. And that has subsequently been rebranded as DC Graphic Novels for Young Adults. Bullshit call as far as I'm concerned. I think it's not a child... Well, it's not that it's child unfriendly, but it's also not a child-focused story like something like Dear Justice League. So the fact that it subsequently got the DC Graphic Novel branding is something I've ignored. That's one example of times where, whilst I am laying out these exceptions quite clearly, there are the occasional things that break the rules, and I will talk about that when it comes up in my main reading guides. Annoyingly, DC Graphic Novels for Young Adults actually didn't take long before it started to splinter into little subgroups and sub-imprints like DC Icons within DC Graphic Novels for Young Adults. So that was really annoying. Another thing I'm excluding are digital-only comics, or comics that were digital first. That means stuff like DC Bombshells, Gotham City Garage, Suicide Squad Hell to Pay. They were all digital first and initially digital-only comics, and even though they were later printed as physical trades, as a result, I'm not including them. That's just my call, and that's how it is. There is an exception to the exception, and we'll get to that when we get to the Superman section of my DC Rebirth guide, where I am including one of them, but there's a reason for that, and you'll see why when we get to it. That'll be in like a month or two's time, I guess. I'm also not including video game tie-ins, so things like Injustice 2. The first series got released digitally during the New 52, but like the comics that tied into the Batman Arkham games, which also came out during the New 52 era, I'm excluding Injustice and Injustice 2 as it's clearly its own thing, warranting its own video. And actually, come to think of it, it was digital first as well, so there's multiple reasons to just completely exclude it. I am excluding DC manga, so by this I mean comics such as Batman Justice Buster and Joker 1 Operation Joker. A couple of reasons for this. One, I don't read manga. I don't like manga. I've tried manga. I'm not closed-minded. I have tried it. It's just not really for me. And these are definitely out of continuity and just completely off on the periphery as their own things. Another thing that I'm not going to be including is retro DC, which I define as anything with a kind of nostalgic vibe and nostalgic year in the title. So Batman 66, Superman 78, Batman 89, Wonder Woman 77, all those sorts of things, which are all part of the retro crash bang wallop sort of Adam West kind of homage comics, or in fact homages to Tim Burton's Batman or the Christopher Reeve Superman, that sort of stuff. That's retro DC. It's obviously out of continuity, forms its own thing. I might do a reading guide on that at some point in the future, but it's not really part of the DC Rebirth universe, even though some of them were published during that time window I've said. I'm going to be excluding Jinx World. So Jinx World is actually the imprint for all the works done by the creator, Brian Michael Bendis. Now, Jinx World is a bit of a weird one. It's bounced from publisher to publisher to publisher. Technically, it began with a comic called Jinx and then a comic called Torso in the late 90s. That was published under Image and written by Bendis. That's all he did there for ages. Then in 2010, he launched a comic called Scarlet through Icon Comics. So Icon Comics was like an imprint of Marvel Comics that was specifically for creator-owned titles that was designed to give their A-list creators like a bit of a pressure release valve, so they'd carry on producing for Marvel rather than taking unique non-superhero creator-owned work to other places like Image. Icon's now shut down. It shut down in 2017, but Scarlet was published through that. Then what happened, and again we'll cover this when we get to the Superman section of my DC Rebirth guide, is that DC then got this exclusive contract with Bendis. They managed to lure him over from Marvel in 2018 so that he could write Superman and Wonder Comics and a few other things. And so as part of that, they agreed to take on Jinx World and to publish all the Jinx World titles from that point forward. So that meant a comic called Pearl, there's another one called Cover, there's another volume of Scarlet and United States versus Murder Inc. So they pulled those over from Marvel's Icon Comics because Bendis still owned them. Technically, the earlier Jinx and Torso comics that were published under Image come under Jinx World as well. And at the time of writing, I don't really know what's going on because Pearl and possibly others are now being published by Dark Horse Comics. So I don't really know what's going on with Jinx World. But anyway, all of this is basically Brian Michael Bendis' crime noir Jinx World universe. It deserves its own video, and I'll do its own reading thing as its own thing. But like the Murphyverse, which is what I did in my last video, it's just its own separate thing that sprawls out well before DC Rebirth started, carries on well after DC Rebirth continues, and really has no bearing on the actual mainline DC continuity in any way. Another thing that I'm not going to be covering is Earth 1. I've actually got a different video on my channel covering Earth 1 in a lot of detail, but just in case you want to know what it is, it's an imprint of graphic novels published by DC, and it's basically like another reboot or retcon. It reimagines and modernizes the company's main superhero characters. So there's 3 volumes of Superman, 3 volumes of Batman and of Wonder Woman, there's 2 volumes of Green Lantern and of Teen Titans. The imprint originally started in 2010, so that was a year before the New 52, and the most recent release was Batman Volume 3 in 2021, which was actually released a few months after DC Rebirth ended. So loads of reasons why I just wouldn't continue, or why I wouldn't include this rather. And I could say all of these volumes, of which there are 13 in total, just form their own Earth 1 continuity, and there's a separate guide on my channel covering all of them. So if you're interested, just check that out. Consider it as already done. As I mentioned in my Black Label video, some Black Label stories I am not going to be including, and I'll just run through them again here just for completeness. Superman Year 1 is something I consider to be part of the Millerverse, and as a result is covered in my series on my channel. Actually, it's covered across 3 different reading guides I had. One about the Millerverse, one about the extended Dark Knight Returns universe, which we'll come to again in a moment, and one in a playlist I have on all the year ones that DC has ever done. Another Black Label story I'm not going to include is Dark Knight Returns The Golden Child, which again, part of the Millerverse and part of the extended Dark Knight Returns universe. I'm covered in my video on both of those. The Black Label story Batman Last Night on Earth is something that I decided not to include because that's going to go in part of New 52 epilogues, which is going to be covered under my main DC Rebirth order, and specifically actually the core continuity main storyline part of it. I know, there's lots of sections within sections, but hopefully it makes sense. I won't be covering Sweet Tooth The Return, which is functionally a continuation of a Vertigo series despite the Black Label branding, and I'm not going to be covering American Vampire 1976 for the same reason despite the branding. I'm not going to cover Sandman Universe. I mentioned this before. I'm not a fan of Sandman, and more importantly, the line itself is one which relaunched in August 2018 with the Sandman Universe with a titular one-shot and then 4 ongoing series: House of Whispers, Lucifer, Books of Magic, The Dreaming. It's basically something where it's got its own self-contained universe. Whilst Dream is meant to be part of the DC universe and actually shows up in Dark Knight's Metal momentarily, the truth is he's not. And the truth is, whilst this was pitched as being something that spins out of Dark Knight's Metal, you don't really have to consider it that way. So as a result, I'm not considering any of this to be in DC Rebirth, and that includes the 2016 3-volume Lucifer comic, which was Vertigo branded. Again, as mentioned, I'm not going to be covering Hill House Comics. That's a pop-up horror line of comics founded and curated by Stephen King's son, Joe Hill. The first title was released on October 30th, 2019. The last title, which was Refrigerator Full of Heads, concludes in April 2022. Basically, it's continued well after DC Rebirth finished, and to be honest, it would warrant its own reading guide if I wanted to do one. Speaking of which, last week I dropped a guide on the Murphyverse, which is the 5 different series that fall under the Sean Murphy curated imprint, which is like White Knight, Curse of the White Knight, and so on. All of these are Black Label. Technically, they started before Black Label launched, and only got pulled into that, but they actually continue well beyond after Rebirth ended, and frankly, like I say, deserves its own video, which is why I did one last week, because a lot of people were asking. And the last one, and this is pretty random, is I'm not going to be including He-Man comics. So you may or may not be aware that He-Man comics are and have been published by DC. The very first one was published back in 1982, but in the more rebooted era, we'll see that in 2012, so during the New 52, they started publishing Masters of the Universe comics. Now, admittedly, that first series was a digital first, so we would exclude it. But subsequently, they released 2 series for He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, some one-shots, DC Universe versus Masters of the Universe, and then getting into the Rebirth era, we had stuff like He-Man Thundercats, and crossovers with other comics we're excluding, like Injustice, because there was Injustice versus Masters of the Universe. So like I say, it started well before DC Rebirth. It started back in the New 52 era, and depends how far back you want to go. You could argue it started well before then. And it continues well past the DC Rebirth era. In fact, the current publication of He-Man is actually being published by Dark Horse, so I don't actually know what's going on there. But long story short, it doesn't really intersect with anything of any kind of value. It's a He-Man universe first, rather than DC first. And so as a result, it's also going to be something, whilst there's quite a lot of it, and I kid you not, there's like 9 different series of He-Man, I'm not going to cover them. Whether I do a separate reading order one day, I don't know. I've never been a massive He-Man fan, but who knows. So yeah, I'm not going to include that. Right, that's it. All I wanted to do was just run that past you, because a few people had commented and got a little bit confused with what I was excluding and what I wasn't excluding and so on. So just let you know, that's all the stuff that I am excluding entirely from what I consider to be DC Rebirth, and that's the rationale why. Going back to the main DC Rebirth, this is my plan for the 8 sections that I have. As you can see, there are 8 sections. I've already covered 3 of them. Of the ones that are left, the next thing I'm going to be looking at is out of continuity comics. And I'll be covering that literally in my next video. It's probably going to be a two-parter because we're now getting into the bigger chunks of this. What I will say is that, of course, you could argue that literally everything that I've just said in this video is technically out of continuity. Yeah, sure, you can say that, that's fine. But stuff like He-Man, stuff like Jinx World, I mean, there's out of continuity and then there's out of continuity. Like, Jinx World isn't even in the same fucking ballpark as the rest of DC as far as I'm concerned. Whereas the stuff we'll be talking about within my DC Rebirth reading guide, so this bullet point here, which is out of continuity, is going to be stuff that actually clearly makes sense to include. There are going to be Green Lantern stories, there are going to be Swamp Thing stories, there are going to be all sorts of stories that are clearly tangential or part of the same superhero flavour that hopefully we all know and love. Anyway, I'll get into that next time. Like I say, I suspect it's going to be a two-parter in terms of the out and continuity issues that we have. But yeah, as always, we are spiraling slowly closer and closer to that top bullet point there, which is the core DC Rebirth universe. And thank you for coming along on this journey, video by video, as we're trimming off the fat and getting down to the lean core series. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please support the channel by picking up the Prose novel, which costs less than $1. In fact, it's free if you're on Kindle Unlimited. Just download it, flick through it. It still counts as someone reading it in terms of the Amazon stats. So that's always good to know. And until next time, everyone, stay classy.